She clutched his arm beneath the burning desert sun, whispering words she had never dared to say before. The desert stretched endlessly, a sea of dust and scorched earth where even the wind seemed too weary to carry sound. The town of Dry Creek clung to existence at the edge of this wasteland, its buildings sun-bleached and splintered, its people worn thin by hunger, drought, and the weight of old grudges. Every face in that town carried a shadow, and every eye seemed fixed on the horizon, waiting for salvation that never came. Evelyn Carter stood at the center of it all, a woman shaped by loss, yet stubborn enough to remain standing when others had fallen. She had buried her father at 20, her husband at 23, and the little child she once dreamed of cradling had never come to life at all. What was left of her family name was carved into weather-worn stone markers in the crooked cemetery outside town. People whispered that she was cursed, that wherever she planted her feet, sorrow took root. She heard them, and though she lifted her chin in defiance, the words clung to her ribs like burrs. Still, Evelyn kept her father's house, now faded and leaning with age, because it was all she had left. Some days, she worked herself until her hands bled, repairing fences or hauling water from a well nearly dry. Other days, she simply sat on the porch, staring across the desert until her eyes blurred, waiting for something, anything, to shift her fate. It was on such a day, with the sun hanging mercilessly overhead and the dust curling in restless spirals, that she saw him. The rider appeared like a mirage on the horizon, a lone figure moving slow but steady, his horse limping under the weight of both distance and memory. His hat was pulled low, his coat ragged at the edges, and though she could not yet see his eyes, Evelyn felt a strange current ripple through her. Men passed through Dry Creek all the time, drifters, outlaws, traders, but something about this one made her heart pound harder against her chest. When he dismounted, the sound of boots hitting the ground echoed louder than the usual stillness. He tied his horse loosely at the post outside the saloon, glanced once at the crooked sign, then turned his gaze toward the well at the edge of town. His face was sharp, tanned from years beneath the sun, with a scar cutting across his jawline like a half-forgotten story. He moved with the quiet calculation of a man who had seen too much, survived too much, and trusted too little. The townsfolk noticed him too. Mothers pulled children closer. Men narrowed their eyes, and whispers followed him like dust trailing a horse. Evelyn heard one word float above the others: drifter. That single word carried both warning and promise. A drifter could mean danger, but a drifter could also mean change. She found herself moving before she thought it through, stepping into his path as he approached the well. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, the world narrowed to that single gaze. His eyes were a gray so pale they seemed carved from stone, yet behind them flickered something Evelyn recognized instantly: pain. "Water?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. He studied her for a moment, then nodded once. She lowered the bucket into the well, the rope creaking as she pulled it back up. As she handed him the dipper, his roughened hand brushed hers. It was the smallest touch, but it sent a current through her body, like a jolt reminding her she was still alive. He drank without a word, then handed it back with the kind of quiet that was heavier than speech. "Name's James," he finally said, voice low, gravelly, as though each word was dragged across sharp edges. "Evelyn," she replied, though she had the strange sense he already knew. For a while, neither spoke. They simply stood there, strangers tied together by silence. Then James broke it. "This town's dying." His bluntness stung, but she couldn't deny it. Dry Creek had been dying for years, gasping for water, gasping for mercy. "We're still here," she said softly, a note of defiance in her tone. "Maybe you shouldn't be," James replied, his eyes shifting toward the horizon. "Places like this, they don't let go easy. They take from you until there's nothing left." She wanted to challenge him, but something in his voice stopped her. It wasn't cruelty, it was knowledge. He spoke like a man who had seen towns crumble, people break, dreams turn to dust. And yet, as he turned to walk away, something inside her panicked. She couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, like a man weighed down by ghosts. Maybe it was the silence in his eyes. mirroring the silence in her own life. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her, that if he left, something inside her would collapse for good. Her hand shot out, clutching his arm. The fabric of his coat was rough beneath her fingers, but the warmth of his body bled through. For the first time in years, she let herself plead, "Don't go." He froze, not turning, not speaking, but she felt the tension in his arm beneath her grip. Around them, the town carried on, horses snorting, saloon doors creaking, but in that moment, it was as if the desert itself held its breath. She had never begged before, not when her father lay dying, not when her husband was lowered into the ground. She had swallowed her grief in silence, worn her suffering like armor. But now, before a stranger she barely knew, the words tumbled out. "Please, don't leave me." James turned then, his eyes narrowing as though he couldn't quite believe what he'd heard. His jaw worked, as if he were fighting to form words, but none came. Instead, he pulled gently free from her grip, stepped back toward his horse, and adjusted the reins. Evelyn's chest tightened. She felt the weight of the desert pressing down, the ache of years of loneliness clawing at her insides. If he rode away now, he would take with him the fragile flicker of hope she hadn't even known she still carried. James placed a boot in the stirrup, preparing to mount. The moment stretched unbearably, the air thick with unspoken truths. Then, just as he swung a leg over the saddle, Evelyn's voice broke through the stillness, shaking, desperate, raw. "Please, don't leave me." The words hung in the air, fragile but unshakable, and for the first time since setting foot in Dry Creek, James froze. Would James leave Dry Creek behind? Or was Evelyn's plea enough to shatter the walls he had built around his scarred heart? "Please don't leave me," she begged, her voice cracking like glass under pressure. The words slipped out of Evelyn before she could catch them, and once spoken, they could not be taken back. The desert seemed to hold its breath. A horse stamped impatiently against the hard ground. The saloon doors creaked in the wind, and a crow called from the cemetery hill, but in that moment, everything else fell silent. Her hands trembled as she realized what she had said. She had lived her life wrapped in walls of silence, never daring to beg anyone for anything. Not when her father coughed his last breath. Not when her husband was lowered into the earth. Not when the town whispered behind her back that she was a woman cursed. But here she was, pleading with a stranger whose name she had only just learned. Why? The question burned in her chest. Why had she said it? Why had she revealed the rawest part of herself to a man who owed her nothing? Perhaps it was because loneliness had been her cruelest companion. For years, Evelyn had carried it like a stone strapped to her back. She ate alone, slept alone, prayed alone. Every night she listened to the wind whistle through cracks in her house, and every morning she awoke to a silence so heavy it felt like punishment. To watch another man ride away, especially one who had sparked something fragile in her, was unbearable. Her eyes burned, but she held her ground, her hand still clutching the sleeve of his coat. Her voice shook again, this time steadier, quieter, as though she were speaking only to herself. "I can't watch another person leave me behind." James's jaw tightened. He did not turn, but she saw the faintest flicker in the muscles of his face. For a long time, he said nothing. Silence was his shield, and it had served him well across a life filled with shadows. Words, he knew, had weight. Once spoken, they bound men in ways bullets never could. Yet her voice cut through his armor. Behind those trembling words, he heard the echo of his own ghosts. James had been a soldier once. Long before he became a drifter, he had worn a uniform and carried a rifle under a flag that promised honor but delivered only blood. He remembered nights when the sky turned red from fire, when screams carried farther than prayers, when men who called each other brothers fell one by one into the dirt. He remembered the betrayal that had come after the commanding officer who sold his men's lives for money, the woman he thought he'd marry who disappeared into the arms of another. War had taken more than his youth. It had taken the very part of him that once believed in staying. So he left, again and again, from towns, from people, from the broken fragments of trust that threatened to bind him. He had convinced himself that drifting was survival, that distance kept him safe. But now, This woman's plea stirred something dangerous, the possibility of belonging. Evelyn did not know the details of his past, but she could feel it, the weight in his silence, the heaviness in his gaze. She recognized it because she carried her own burden. She remembered the day the fever swept through Dry Creek, taking her father in the span of 3 nights. She remembered the accident that claimed her husband, a splintered beam crushing him in the collapsed barn. And she remembered how, afterward, the town turned cold. Friends who once shared bread with her looked away in the street. Neighbors muttered that God had marked her. Even the sheriff, once a childhood friend, began to avoid her eyes. Loss had hollowed her, and shame had finished the carving. Every day was survival, but every night she wondered how much longer she could endure the silence of being unwanted. That was why she begged now, not because she knew this man, but because something in her soul recognized his loneliness as her own. James finally lowered his head, staring at the ground between his boots. His hand twitched against the reins, not in anger but in conflict. She had forced him to confront the very thing he had been running from. He felt the weight of his past pressing against his chest, the memories clawing at the edges of his mind. He saw faces of men he couldn't save, women he couldn't love, homes he couldn't keep. He had told himself he was cursed too, that staying anywhere meant bringing ruin. And now she asked him to stay. The silence between them grew unbearable. Evelyn's eyes searched his face, desperate for any sign that her plea had reached him. He looked carved from stone, but she sensed movement beneath the surface, like a river buried deep underground. He inhaled sharply, his chest rising as though words fought their way out. His lips parted, but whatever sound he made was softer than the wind. Evelyn leaned closer, straining to catch it, but the noise of the saloon doors swinging open drowned it. Still, she caught the faintest whisper, low and broken, slipping from James's mouth. She could not make out the words. A name, a memory, a confession. Her heart pounded. She released his sleeve, stepping back, but her eyes stayed locked on him. What did James whisper? Was it a secret from his haunted past, or the beginning of a truth that could bind him to Evelyn forever? The silence between them was heavier than any bullet James had ever faced. James stood with his back to Evelyn, his hand still resting on the saddle as though her words had tethered him more tightly than any rope. For a moment, he did not move. He neither mounted nor turned. Evelyn waited, her chest tight, her throat raw, but he offered nothing, no answer, no explanation, only the suffocating weight of silence. It was in that silence that the truth became clear. She longed for safety, for someone to anchor her against the storms of gossip and the emptiness of nights that stretched endlessly. He, on the other hand, longed for the road. She could see it in the way his shoulders tensed, in the restless twitch of his horse, in the steady rhythm of his breath. He was a man built for leaving, not staying. Evelyn lowered her hand, suddenly aware of the eyes watching from porches and doorways. The townsfolk had seen her beg. Whispers already stirred the air, like dry leaves blown by a restless wind. She heard the faint hiss of a woman muttering, "She's cursed another one," and the hollow laugh of a man who added, "Won't be long before he disappears too." Her face burned with humiliation, but she kept her chin high. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her falter. James finally swung into the saddle, his shadow stretching long across the dusty street. He said nothing as he guided his horse forward, but just before leaving the edge of town, he stopped. For a brief second, Evelyn thought he might look back. He didn't. He simply rode on, leaving her with the echo of silence. By the following morning, the gossip had grown louder. Men in the saloon spoke of trouble brewing in the canyon, whispers of riders seen moving like shadows across the ridges. The canyon had always been a place of danger, where outlaws hid and strangers vanished. But now the stories carried more urgency. Some claimed a gang was gathering, led by a ruthless man with a grudge against anyone fool enough to give shelter to the wrong kind of drifter. The rumors spread like wildfire, and Evelyn felt the heat of every stare when she walked through town. She could not escape the suggestion that her brief connection with James had already cursed Dry Creek. Children whispered her name, women pulled their husbands closer, and men spat in the dirt when she passed. The sheriff confronted her 2 days later, His face, once familiar with the softness of shared childhood, had hardened into lines of authority. He found her on the porch of her father's house, where she sat sewing by lamplight, and placed his hands firmly on the railing. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low, almost pitying, "you don't know that man. And if the talk around town is true, you don't want to know him." She looked up. Needle paused mid-stitch. "And what do you know?" "I know drifters," the sheriff replied. "They don't settle. They don't stay. And some of them bring worse than heartbreak. You've already lost too much. Don't let yourself be dragged into another grave." The words struck hard, but Evelyn's jaw tightened. "You think I don't know loss? You think I don't understand what it costs to trust?" She set her sewing aside, her eyes burning. "But if every man who wanders through is condemned before he speaks, then maybe it's this town that's cursed, not me." The sheriff's expression softened, but his tone remained firm. "This isn't about curses. It's about survival. If you stand beside him when the canyon trouble comes knocking, you'll go down with him." He left her with that warning, boots crunching down the dusty path, the glow of his lantern fading into the night. Evelyn sat in the silence, her hands shaking, but she did not bend to his words. Something inside her had shifted. For years she had let this town's whispers shape her life, make her doubt her own worth. But James, silent, scarred, and unyielding, had awakened something else, defiance. The next day, she found herself walking toward the livery stable where James's horse had been kept. She wasn't sure what she expected, perhaps proof that he had already vanished into the horizon, leaving her plea behind like a forgotten dream. Yet as she stepped inside the dimly lit barn, the air thick with hay and dust, she saw his saddle propped against the wall. His horse remained tethered, restless, but fed. James had not left completely. Curiosity gnawed at her. She moved closer to the saddle, running her fingers along the worn leather. That was when she noticed the edge of something tucked beneath the flap, a folded piece of parchment, the corner stiff and stained dark. She hesitated, then pulled it free. The letter was smeared with dirt, its surface creased and frayed. But what made her breath catch was the blotch of dried blood across the corner. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, eyes darting to the scrawled handwriting within. The words blurred at first, then sharpened into sentences that made her heart pound. She could not read more than a few lines before the barn seemed to close in around her. The words hinted at violence, at debts unpaid, at promises broken. There was a name she did not recognize, followed by the chilling phrase, "He won't escape us again." Her pulse raced as she clutched the letter tighter, the bloodstain glaring against the page. Suddenly, everything the sheriff had said, everything the townsfolk whispered, crashed together in her mind. What secrets lay hidden in James's blood-stained letter, and would they prove he was the very danger Dry Creek feared, or the only man who could save it? The letter trembled in her hands, each word cutting deeper than the last. Evelyn sat on a bale of hay in the dim barn, the lantern's glow flickering across the rough boards. Her hands shook as she forced herself to read beyond the first scattered lines. The letter was not written in the tidy script of a gentleman. It was rushed, jagged, like words carved in. Desperation. James owes blood. James owes death. The canyon will not forgive him. The words blurred as her pulse hammered in her ears. She turned the page over, saw more references to raids, stolen gold, and names crossed out with violent strokes. One line chilled her more than the rest. "If he rides again, we ride him down. He cannot outrun his own." She dropped the letter in her lap, her breath ragged. All the questions that had shadowed her since James first appeared now loomed larger. Was he a savior, or had she tethered herself to a wolf disguised as a man? The sound of footsteps startled her. She looked up to see James in the doorway, the barn lantern behind him painting his frame in long shadows. His face was unreadable, his eyes harder than she had ever seen. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was filled only by the restless shift of his horse. "You found it," he said at last, his voice flat. Evelyn clutched the letter, anger and fear rising together. "What is this? Who are these men? And what do they mean you owe them blood?" James stepped forward, his boots crunching on the straw. He did not try to take the letter from her. Instead, he lowered himself onto a stool across from her, his gaze fixed on the dirt floor. "It's not a story I ever wanted you to read. That's not an answer," she shot back, her voice trembling. "This town is whispering about gangs in the canyon, and now I find this. Tell me, James, did you bring death to our doorstep?" His jaw clenched. For a long moment, she thought he might walk away, retreat into the silence he wore like armor. But then he spoke, his tone low, weighted with memory. "I rode with them once," he confessed, "not because I wanted to, but because after the war, a man with no home doesn't get to choose much. I was younger then, angry, hungry. They gave me a horse, a gun, and a reason to keep moving. At first, it felt like survival, but the blood, they spilled." He paused, his throat tightening. "The blood I spilled, it changed everything." Evelyn stared at him, her chest tight. She wanted to believe there was more, that he had been trapped, forced, but the hardness in his tone told her it was not that simple. "They killed for money?" she asked. "They killed for less than that," James admitted. "For fear, for silence, sometimes for sport. I lasted longer than I should have, telling myself I'd leave when the time was right. But you don't leave men like that. Not alive." Her hands trembled around the letter. "Then how did you escape?" His eyes finally met hers, and she saw the shadow there, the shadow of men whose faces still haunted him. "I didn't escape. I ran. I left in the night after a raid went wrong. They slaughtered a rancher's family for refusing to pay. I couldn't watch it anymore. I pulled the trigger once that night, but not on the rancher, on one of my own. Then I rode until my horse nearly collapsed. The barn seemed to shrink around them. Evelyn wanted to recoil, to turn away from the man who admitted to blood on his hands. But something held her. Maybe it was the raw honesty in his voice, the way his confession cracked like glass breaking. Or maybe it was the flicker of shame, the mark of a man who knew he could never outrun his sins. "Do they still hunt you?" she whispered. "They don't stop hunting men like me," he replied. "That letter is proof. They'll come until one side is gone." Her mind spun. The sheriff's warning replayed in her head. "If you stand beside him, you'll go down with him." Every logical part of her screamed to distance herself, to walk away before his past swallowed her whole. And yet, when she looked at him, she did not see only a drifter marked by blood. She saw the man who drank from her well without mocking her, who listened more than he spoke, who carried grief in silence the same way she did. She saw not just danger, but the possibility of connection, the kind she had been denied for so long. "I should tell the sheriff," she said at last, though her voice lacked conviction. James didn't flinch. "Maybe you should. Maybe that's the only way to keep yourself safe. But if I do," she swallowed hard, tears pricking her eyes, "then I'm no better than the town that abandoned me. You left that life once. If I turn you in, I'd be condemning you to the same judgment they gave me." The air grew heavy again, thick with everything unspoken. James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His voice was softer now, but no less haunted. "Evelyn, I don't deserve your trust, and I damn sure don't deserve your mercy, but you should know the truth before you decide." Her heart ached with the weight of his words. Fear and longing twisted together, pulling her in two directions. Logic told her he was a danger. Her soul told her he was the only person who understood her silence. The barn door rattled suddenly, thrown open by a gust of wind. The lantern's flame flickered wildly, casting shadows that looked like men closing in. Evelyn startled, clutching the letter tight. James rose to his feet, every muscle tense, as if he too expected the past to come crashing through the door. The night outside had gone strangely quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed on the skin. And then, the sound shattered it, 3 sharp gunshots, echoing across the dark, rolling like thunder from the canyon. Evelyn's heart lurched as she turned to James, but when she spun back, he was gone. The gunfire still echoed in the night, but James had vanished into the darkness. Was he running to fight, or running from her? The sound of hooves tearing through the dust carried only one message: war was coming. The town of Dry Creek woke to the thunder of horses. In the gray light of dawn, Riders poured across the horizon like shadows ripped from the earth, their dust, cloud blotting out the rising Sunday. Mothers pulled children from the street, shutters slammed, and even the old saloon piano fell silent. The sound of hooves wasn't just travel, it was warning, and everyone in town knew it. At the head of the riders was a man whose presence seemed to suck the air from the street. Victor Kane, broad-shouldered, dark-eyed, his jaw lined with an old scar that split his mouth into a half-smile, half-sneer. To those who whispered his name, he was no ordinary outlaw. He had once commanded loyalty with the crack of his voice, and fear with the twitch of his finger on a trigger. Kane wasn't the kind of man who robbed for bread or whiskey. He robbed because power demanded sacrifice, and he took pleasure in being the executioner. And Kane knew James. The gang drew their horses to a halt outside the saloon. Kane dismounted first, his boots thudding against the dirt, his coat swirling behind him. His eyes scanned the quiet town, lingering on the cracks in the buildings, the townsfolk cowering in doorways. He smirked, as though this pitiful place was already his. Dry Creek, Kane muttered loud enough for those nearby to hear. A ghost town waiting for its grave. He spat into the dust, then raised his voice. Where is he? The townsfolk exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. Evelyn, standing at the far edge of the street, felt her stomach twist. She didn't need to hear James's name. She already knew the he Kane sought. Her worst fear had followed her here, carved into reality by the blood-stained letter she had found. Kane's men spread out, rifles slung across their backs, eyes sharp. The sheriff stepped out from his office, his badge glinting in the dim light. His hand rested near his revolver, but he didn't draw. He was no fool. Against this many men, his gun meant little. You've got no business here, Kane, the sheriff called, his voice steady but laced with tension. Kane chuckled, slow and cold. Everything that touches him is my business, and word is, your town's been feeding a wolf, a man who owes me more than his life. He paused, his smile stretching cruelly. Tell me where James Whitlock Island. Evelyn flinched at the sound of the name. It was the first time she had heard James's surname spoken aloud. A part of her longed to step forward, to defend him, to say he was no longer the man they hunted. But the weight of the town's stares silenced her. She knew what they were thinking. If Evelyn is tied to him, then she has doomed us all. The sheriff's jaw worked as he measured his words. If he's here, he'll answer to law, not to you. Law? Kane laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. I am the law in the canyon, and my law says he bleeds. The tension broke when one of Kane's men fired into the air, the gunshot cracking through the street. Women screamed, children cried, and the townsfolk scattered like leaves in wind. The gang spread wider, laughing, taunting, knocking over barrels and kicking doors. It was not yet slaughter, but it was promise. Evelyn ran, her breath ragged, her mind racing. The letter's words replayed. He won't escape us again. Kane wasn't just chasing James. He was here to finish something old, something personal. She reached her home, slammed the door shut, and pressed her back against it, her chest heaving. All her resolve, all her defiance, felt fragile now. She had chosen to trust James, to see more in him than his past, but that past had arrived at her doorstep with guns and fury. She whispered to herself, as though trying to believe it. He left. Maybe he's far away by now. Maybe he's safe. But deep down, she knew. Men like James didn't run from their ghosts. They circled back to face them. That night, Dry Creek held its breath. The gang made camp on the outskirts, fires glowing like watchful eyes in the dark. The sheriff doubled his patrols, though every step rang with futility. Families barred their doors, whispering prayers, and Evelyn sat at her table, staring at the folded letter, its bloodstain glaring in the lamplight. Her heart clenched with a mixture of fear and longing. She hated him for bringing this storm, yet hated herself more for wanting him to return. Loneliness whispered cruel truths. She would rather face danger with him than endure safety in silence. The hours stretched, each one heavier than the last. She blew out her lamp and lay awake in the darkness, her ears straining at every sound outside, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the crack of distant laughter from the gang's camp, and then softer, nearer a sound she almost mistook for imagination, a boot scraping her porch. She sat up, her breath caught in her throat. Another sound followed the heavy, uneven thud of someone collapsing against her door. Evelyn's heart raced. She lit the lamp, trembling as she approached. Her hand hovered over the latch, fear urging her to stay back. But something stronger pulled her forward. She unlatched the door slowly, the hinges creaking. There, slumped against the frame, was James. His shirt was torn, soaked dark with blood. His face was pale, his eyes half closed, but when he lifted them to hers, a flicker of stubborn fire remained. "Couldn't. Stay away," he rasped before his body sagged forward. Evelyn dropped to her knees, catching him as the lamp flickered wildly. Cliffhanger. James lay bleeding on her porch. Had he returned to protect her, or had he dragged the gang's vengeance straight to her door? His blood stained her hands as she fought to keep him alive. Evelyn dragged James inside, her arms straining against his weight, her breath ragged with panic. The door banged shut behind them, shutting out the night but not the danger pressing at its edges. His body was heavy and limp, the warmth of his blood seeping through her dress, marking her with the gravity of his return. She half carried, half dragged him to the small cot in the corner of her home, her heart hammering with a terror she hadn't felt since the day she buried her husband. She lit another lamp, the dim glow casting her face in flickering gold as she tore away the shredded fabric of his shirt. The wound was deep, a gunshot tearing through muscle just below his ribs. Blood flowed steadily, pooling beneath him. Evelyn's hands shook, but she forced them steady. She boiled water, tore strips from old sheets, and pressed them hard against the wound. "Stay with me," she whispered fiercely, her voice breaking. "Don't you dare leave me. Not like this." James groaned, his face tightening in pain. His eyes fluttered open, dull at first, then sharpened with effort. "Should've. Kept riding," he rasped. Anger flared hot in her chest. "Then why didn't you?" She snapped, though her voice cracked with fear. She pressed harder against the wound, fighting the flow of blood. "If you meant to keep going, you wouldn't have ended up on my porch half dead. Don't tell me this is just chance." His lips twitched in something between a grimace and a smile. "Didn't mean to stay," he admitted, his voice little more than a breath. "But couldn't keep away. Not from you." Her throat tightened at his words. The fury that had driven her moments ago softened, tangled with something more dangerous hope. She shook her head, fighting the weakness in her chest. "You're a fool, James Whitlock. A damned fool who dragged hell to my door." He coughed, the sound wet and painful, yet his eyes stayed on her. "Maybe, but I'd do it again." For a moment, silence filled the room, heavy but intimate. Evelyn kept working, binding the wound as best she could, but her hands lingered against his skin longer than they needed to. She could feel the rise and fall of his breath, shallow but steadying under her touch. Each heartbeat was a fragile reminder that he was still alive, that she hadn't lost him yet. And in that silence, something shifted. She saw not just the outlaw, not just the man hunted by ghosts, but the man who chose to return when he could have disappeared into the horizon forever. It frightened her how much that choice meant. By morning, James stirred more fully, his face drawn but his eyes clearer. Evelyn had barely slept, sitting beside him with her head propped against the cot. When he moved, she woke instantly, searching his face. "You should rest," he murmured. "I'll rest when I know you're out of danger," she replied sharply, though the redness in her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. He gave a faint, pained chuckle. "You care too much for a man you barely know." Her jaw tightened. "I know enough." The unspoken words hung between them, enough to see the shame behind his silence, enough to recognize the pain mirrored in his eyes, enough to feel the pull that bound them despite the risk. But the outside world was less forgiving. By midday, whispers began to stir in Dry Creek. Neighbors had seen Evelyn drag a bloodied James inside. Some claimed she was hiding him. Others muttered that she was siding with a killer over her own people. The sheriff paid her a visit, but she didn't open the door. She sat inside, watching James breathe, her hand resting lightly on his bandaged chest, determined to shield him from every eye that judged too quickly. Still, the weight of the town pressed in. At night, when the streets were quiet, she heard footsteps pause outside her window, voices lowered in suspicion. "Why's she keeping him alive?" One man muttered. "Maybe she's with him." Another replied. "She'll bring Cain's wrath on all of us if she doesn't hand him over." Evelyn's stomach knotted. She closed her eyes, her hand tightening around James's. He was sleeping, his face slack with exhaustion, unaware of the growing storm outside her walls. She wanted to scream at them all, to tell them they were cowards, that they had turned their backs on her long before James ever came. But she bit her tongue, knowing words would only fuel their fire. Instead, she sat in the silence, caught between fury and fear. She told herself she didn't care what the town thought, but she knew better. Their whispers were knives, and she was already bleeding. Late that night, unable to sleep, Evelyn rose to fetch more water. She moved quietly through the house, her lamp glowing faintly. Passing the open window, she froze. Outside, just beyond the fence, two men stood in the shadows. Their voices carried low, but the stillness of the night carried every word. "Tomorrow we hand him over," one said. "Best way to save the town," the other agreed. "We give Cain his man, and maybe he'll leave us be." Evelyn's blood ran cold. She gripped the windowsill, her breath sharp. They weren't just talking, they were planning to betray James, to deliver him straight into the hands of the gang that wanted him dead. Her lamp flickered as her chest tightened. She turned back toward the cot, where James slept unaware, his life hanging by threads both inside his body and outside her door. Evelyn now knew the townsfolk were ready to hand James over to Cain's gang. But would she risk everything to stop them, or let fate take him away? Betrayal cut sharper than any knife when Evelyn heard her neighbors whispering. Evelyn rose before dawn, her body heavy with exhaustion, but her mind sharpened by the voices she'd overheard the night before. Each word still echoed in her skull: plans to hand James over, schemes to barter his life for the town's safety. She had lived among these people her entire life. She had mourned beside them, worked alongside them, endured their whispers. But this was different. This was betrayal laid bare, and it cut deeper than she thought possible. By the time the morning sun stretched across the dry earth, Evelyn had left James sleeping inside and walked straight to the well in the center of town. Faces turned as she approached: men with calloused hands, women with guarded eyes, children peeking out from behind skirts. Whispers swelled like a storm. She didn't flinch. Her voice carried across the square, clear and unshaken. "I know what you're planning," she said. "I know you mean to hand him over." The crowd stiffened. An older man spat in the dirt. "If we don't, Cain will burn this town to the ground. Better one man dies than all of us," another muttered. Evelyn's gaze swept over them, fury and hurt colliding. "You think this is about survival? No, it's about fear. You'd sell a man's life to save your own skins, and you call that justice?" A woman folded her arms. "That man brought them here. You'd risk our children for a stranger's sins? He's no stranger," Evelyn shot back. "He left that life behind. He's bleeding in my home because he stood against them. He is not the danger you are, if you let Cain believe we'll kneel." The sheriff stepped forward then, his face drawn tight. His badge caught the light as he rested a hand on his holster, not as a threat, but as a reminder of his place between order and chaos. "Evelyn," he said, his voice heavy, "I can't protect this town and protect him too. Cain's men won't leave until Whitlock's in their hands." She squared her shoulders. "Then let them come. Let them see this town won't be bullied." His jaw tightened. "You don't understand. This isn't bravery, it's suicide. If you keep him, you'll lose everything. Your home, your land, your life." The words stung more than she wanted to admit, but she refused to let them see fear in her. She turned on her heel and left, the whispers of neighbors chasing her down the street like knives thrown at her back. Inside her home, James was awake, sitting up against the wall, his face pale but his eyes sharp with awareness. He had heard enough. "They're right," he said quietly. Evelyn froze. What? His expression was grim. I should go. I've brought nothing but trouble to this place. To you. She crossed the room in 2 strides, anger surging through her chest. You think leaving will fix this? They'll still be here. Cain will still want blood. Running will only prove them right. James shook his head. You don't understand the kind of men I rode with. They don't stop. If I'm here, they'll keep coming. If I'm gone, maybe they'll leave you be. Her throat tightened. And what about me? He looked at her then, his gray eyes raw with something she had never seen before, guilt tangled with longing. I never meant to stay, Evelyn, but I can't seem to leave you behind. That's the part I can't make sense of. Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them back, her voice trembling as she forced it steady. Then don't leave. For once in your life, fight to stay. With me. The room fell silent except for the faint crackle of the fire. James's breath came shallow, his shoulders tense, as though her words pressed against walls he'd spent years building. Slowly, painfully, he shook his head. You don't know what you're asking. I know exactly what I'm asking, she whispered. I've buried everyone I ever loved, and I won't bury you too. If you ride away, James, you'll take the last of me with you. For a long moment, neither moved. Then James looked away, as though her eyes burned too bright to meet. That night, the weight of her plea still hung heavy in the air. Evelyn stayed close to him, dozing fitfully in a chair by his side, but something gnawed at her gut, a dread she couldn't shake. She woke once to find him watching her, his hat in his lap, his expression carved from stone. She reached for his hand, but he only squeezed her fingers once before letting go. Exhaustion claimed her again, and when she woke next, the chair beside her was empty. Panic clawed through her as she stumbled to her feet. The door creaked in the wind, open just a crack. Her eyes darted around, searching for him, but the room was bare. She rushed outside, calling his name into the night. No answer, only the endless hush of desert wind. Then she saw it lying on the porch step, its brim catching the moonlight. His hat, the same battered hat he never removed, the one piece of himself he always carried. Her chest tightened as she knelt, clutching it to her. He was gone. James had vanished into the night, leaving only his hat behind had he left to protect her, or to surrender himself to Cain. Dawn broke, but his absence felt darker than midnight. The first rays of sun spilled across Dry Creek, painting the desert gold, but Evelyn felt none of its warmth. She stood on the porch, clutching James's hat against her chest as though it were a lifeline. The silence around her house was unbearable. Too still, too final. He was gone. She stepped off the porch, her boots sinking slightly into the dust, her eyes scanning the horizon. She told herself she wouldn't follow. She told herself he had chosen his path, and it wasn't hers to walk. But even as the thought formed, her feet moved. James had left traces, hoofprints etched into the dry earth. Faint, impressions that stretched toward the canyon like breadcrumbs of fate. Evelyn knew she could not let him vanish into that endless expanse. With every step, the weight of fear pressed harder. The sheriff's warning replayed in her head. If you keep him, you'll lose everything. Maybe this was the price already unfolding. Yet the ache in her chest was stronger than caution. She had lost too much in her life to let him slip into the desert without a fight. The tracks led her past the last of Dry Creek's crumbling fences, past the crooked cemetery gate where her father and husband lay beneath weather-worn stones. She paused, whispering a prayer not for herself but for the man who carried death in his shadow. Then she moved on. As the morning stretched, the desert grew harsher. Heat shimmered in waves, dust stung her eyes, and the silence became oppressive. Still, she pressed forward, eyes fixed on the trail. Every so often, she found evidence, a broken branch where a horse had brushed past, a dark drop in the sand that might have been blood. Her heart clenched with each sign, torn between fear for James and dread of what lay ahead. By noon, she reached the outer ridges of the canyon. The rocks rose jagged and red, looming like teeth ready to swallow anyone who dared to enter. Here, the hoofprints grew chaotic, scuffed as though there had been a struggle. Evelyn knelt, her fingers brushing the disturbed earth. Her pulse spiked. This wasn't just a trail, it was a battlefield waiting to happen. From the shadows of the canyon walls, faint echoes drifted, laughter, metal clinking, the low murmur of men's voices. She froze, pressing herself against a boulder, straining to listen. Though she couldn't make out the words, the tone was unmistakable. Men, preparing for violence. James. The thought of him walking straight into this trap churned her stomach. He had left to protect her, but she could see now that protection was impossible. Kane's men weren't circling Dry Creek for a bargain, they were waiting here, in the canyon, ready to bleed him dry. Meanwhile, James staggered across the rocky ground not far from where she crouched unseen. His side still burned from the wound he had carried out of Dry Creek, every step pulling at torn flesh. His breath came ragged, sweat streaking down his face. He had tried to outpace the voices that haunted him, but the desert gave him no cover. He knew Kane's men too well. He had trained beside them once, fought beside them, killed beside them. They knew how he moved, how he thought, the cracks in his armor. And now, they hunted him with the precision of wolves. James paused near a dried-out stream bed, pressing a hand against his ribs. Blood slicked his palm. He looked toward the horizon, whispering to himself like a man delivering his last confession. Not here. Not yet. Evelyn, hidden higher on the ridge, caught sight of him, then a lone figure against the brutal sun. Shoulders hunched but unbroken, relief surged, followed by fear as movement flickered in the rocks behind him. Shadows detached themselves from the stone, men on horseback sliding into position, rifles glinting in the light. The ambush was already unfolding. Her instinct screamed to run back, to fetch the sheriff, to do anything but stay. She had no weapon strong enough, no allies at her side. Yet when she looked at James, bleeding and unaware of the noose tightening around him, she knew she could not turn back. She had begged him once not to leave her. Now it was her turn not to leave him. She moved carefully, step by step, tracing a narrow path along the ridge. Sweat stung her eyes. Rocks scraped her palms, but she kept going, fueled by desperation. Every noise from below tightened the knot in her chest. At last, she rounded a curve in the rocks and froze. Below her lay a small clearing where fires burned low and men lounged with rifles across their laps. The gang. She counted at least a dozen rough-faced men, scarred by violence and loyalty to their leader. Their laughter carried sharp and cruel, like hyenas circling prey. And in the center of camp, chained to a post, was James. His arms were bound, his head bowed, blood soaking the bandages Evelyn had tied only a day before. The men jeered at him, tossing stones, mocking his silence. James did not answer, but Evelyn could see the tension in his frame, the fight in him refusing to die even as the chains dug into his wrists. Her breath caught in her throat. She pressed herself against the rock, trembling. She had found him, but finding him meant seeing the truth laid bare. He was no longer just hunted. He was captured, surrounded, and facing certain death unless she intervened. Evelyn had stumbled upon Kane's camp, and there, chained and bloodied, was James. But could she save him before the gang ended his life? Shackled to a post, the cowboy lifted his head only when he heard her footsteps. Evelyn had tried to stay hidden in the shadows of the ridge, but her heart betrayed her. One misstep on loose gravel sent a sharp crack echoing down into the outlaw camp. The gang turned as one, eyes narrowing, rifles lifting. She froze, caught in their gaze, the heat of a dozen cruel stares pinning her in place. Kane was the first to smile. He stepped forward from the firelight, the scar across his jaw twisting into something that looked more like triumph than humor. "Well, well," he drawled, "the cursed widow of Dry Creek. I was wondering when you'd come sniffing after him." Laughter rippled through the men, hard and mean. They circled her like wolves, their boots grinding the dust. One brushed too close, tugging at her sleeve before she wrenched away. "Careful," Kane warned, though his voice was laced with amusement. "She's come of her own accord. Let's hear what she has to say." Evelyn's throat was dry, her hands trembling, but her eyes locked on James. He sat slumped against the post, chains biting into his wrists, his shirt soaked in fresh blood where the wound had reopened. When their eyes met, something passed between them. Relief, sorrow, desperation. "Run," James rasped, his voice hoarse but urgent. "Evelyn, go. Don't stay here." She shook her head, stepping closer despite the rifles that shifted in warning. "I won't leave you." Kane chuckled, circling them both. "Look at that, she'd rather die with you than live without you. Tragic, ain't it?" His eyes gleamed as he leaned toward Evelyn. "You really think this man is worth saving? You don't know him like I do." James lifted his head weakly. "Don't." His voice was sharp, cutting through the laughter, but Kane only grinned wider. "Oh, I think she deserves the truth." Kane sneered. He turned to his men. "Tell her what he did." A murmur rose from the gang, voices spitting fragments of memory like poison. "Left us in the middle of a raid. Shot one of our own. Ran like a coward while others bled." Evelyn's heart pounded. Her gaze shifted back to James. He shook his head faintly, but Kane wasn't finished. "You know what happened at Clearwater?" Kane's voice dropped, cold and deliberate. "We rode into that rancher's place. The man begged for mercy. He had 2 children, little ones. James was there. He could have stopped us, but he didn't. Not until it was too late. And when the fire started," Kane leaned closer, his voice like a knife. "Those children burned, screaming. And your cowboy here, he ran." The words slammed into Evelyn like a hammer. Her stomach twisted, bile rising. She staggered back a step, staring at James. "Is it true?" His eyes closed for a moment, his face etched with pain deeper than the wound in his side. When he spoke, his voice was hollow. "I couldn't save them." "That's not an answer," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Did you betray them?" His eyes opened, meeting hers with a weight that crushed her. "Yes." The word was barely audible, but it shattered the silence. "I pulled the trigger too late. I turned my back too soon, and I've carried it every day since." The gang roared with cruel laughter, delighting in her horror. Kane clapped his hands mockingly. "There you have it. Your savior, your protector, your precious drifter. Nothing more than a coward who left children to die." Evelyn's legs trembled. Her chest heaved as she tried to breathe, the image Kane painted sinking like claws into her mind. She had believed James was scarred but redeemable. Now she stood on the edge of doubt so sharp it cut her soul. James's voice broke through the din, raw and pleading. "Evelyn, I was a different man then. I swear it. I left that life because I couldn't live with myself. Everything I've done since has been to bury that night." Her hands clenched into fists. Anger, grief, love, all of it warred within her. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him he was no better than the men who laughed around the fire. But when she looked at him, bleeding and chained, his gray eyes hollowed by guilt, she saw something Kane and his gang never would. Regret. Regret that had eaten him alive, shaped every mile he rode, every silence he carried. Still, the choice loomed before her like a gallows. To forgive him was to carry his sins as her own. To abandon him was to let him die by the hands of men who had turned cruelty into sport. The firelight flickered across her face as she stood rooted, her heart split between justice and mercy. Kane, sensing her hesitation, grinned. "Don't worry. You won't have to decide long. Sunrise. We hang him. That way the canyon sees what happens to traitors." Evelyn's breath caught. She turned sharply toward James, but he lowered his head once more, as if already resigned. The men jeered, raising bottles, boasting about the execution to come. Evelyn's pulse hammered, her eyes burning with the prick realization that time was slipping through her fingers. The gang prepared to execute James at sunrise, leaving Evelyn with only a few desperate hours to choose betray him, save him, or watch him die. The desert wind carried the sound of a noose tightening. The gang had tied a thick rope to the crooked limb of a mesquite tree, letting it sway in the midnight breeze. Each creak of the branch was a cruel promise of what awaited James come sunrise. The men laughed around their fire, their bottles clinking, their voices rough with drink and cruelty. The desert itself seemed to carry their laughter, twisting it into something ghostly. Evelyn crouched in the shadows beyond the camp, her chest heaving, her nails digging into the dirt. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to flee into the safety of darkness. But safety meant nothing if James died. Safety meant silence, emptiness, and the kind of life she had barely endured before he came. Her plan was fragile, held together only by desperation. She had no allies, no army, no guarantee she would live past the night. All she carried was courage and the stolen rifle clutched against her chest, taken from an abandoned wagon on her way into the canyon. It felt heavy in her hands, its weight both a comfort and a curse. She studied the camp, every flicker of firelight exposing the movements of Cain's men. They sprawled around the flames, drinking, gambling, sharpening knives. Some stood watch near the horses, though their stances were loose, dulled by exhaustion. The only figure who remained sharp, always alert, was Cain himself. He sat near James, his scar twisting into a permanent sneer, his eyes never leaving the cowboy chained to the post. James sat slumped, his head bowed, his wrists raw from the irons. He did not speak, did not move, save for the faint rise and fall of his chest. To Evelyn, he looked already half dead, his silence a resignation more painful than any wound. She whispered to herself, steadying her breath. "Not while I live, not like this." She began to move, crawling along the outer rocks, every shift of her body stirring dust that threatened to betray her. The moon was cruelly bright, silvering the desert floor, leaving little cover. But she pressed forward, her eyes fixed on the man she refused to lose. Meanwhile, James sat in a haze of exhaustion, his mind drifting between memory and the grim certainty of dawn. He thought of Evelyn, her voice begging him to stay, her hands pressed against his wound, her eyes fierce with a kind of loyalty he had never known. He thought of Clearwater, of smoke and screams, of the children he had failed. Their faces had never left him. They haunted every step, every mile. Tonight, with the noose waiting, the memories came sharper than ever, cutting through his chest like knives. He had told himself he deserved death. Maybe it was justice. Maybe Cain's laughter was the sound of fate balancing its scales. But even as he surrendered to the thought, one image kept pulling him back. Evelyn's face, illuminated by lamplight, refusing to turn away even when the truth of him was uglier than the desert night. He muttered under his breath, words carried only by the wind. "Should have left you safe. Should have kept riding." Cain noticed, leaning closer. "Talking to ghosts, Whitlock? Or that widow who don't know better than to love a coward?" His laughter was sharp, cruel, meant to cut. James gave no answer, his eyes fixed on the ground. At the edge of the camp, Evelyn froze, her pulse pounding. She was close enough now to see the strain in James's face, close enough to hear the mockery in Cain's voice. Her body shook with fear, but it was matched by fury. She thought of everything she had endured, loss, loneliness, betrayal by neighbors, and realized she would rather die fighting than live another day watching the world steal what little she had left. Her hands tightened on the rifle. She moved silently to a vantage point behind a low ridge of stone, the barrel of the weapon steadying against the rock. Her breath came slow, steady, as her eyes fixed on Cain. The leader leaned lazily against the post beside James, his hand resting on his pistol, his scar catching the firelight. He was too close, too smug, too certain of victory. The rope swayed above, its shadow stretching across James like a death sentence already written. Evelyn pressed her cheek against the wood stock of the rifle, her finger brushing the trigger. Her entire body trembled, but her aim did not waver. In her mind, time slowed. She remembered the way James had whispered he couldn't stay away. She remembered the sheriff's warning. She remembered her neighbors plotting to trade his life for their own. None of it mattered now. All that mattered was this single moment, this choice that would define whether James lived or died. The desert wind howled, rattling the mesquite branches. The noose swung wider, creaking like a voice urging her forward. Evelyn took one long breath, steadying her heart. With the rifle braced against her shoulder, Evelyn set her sights on Cain's chest, her finger tightening on the trigger, ready to kill or die trying. One gunshot split the night wide open. The rifle cracked, and the desert swallowed the sound before hurling it back tenfold. Men around the fire jolted, bottles and cards scattering, as Cain staggered backward with a roar, blood blooming across his shoulder. For one glorious heartbeat, silence followed, the kind that comes when fate itself hesitates. Then the camp erupted. Shouts rang out. Gunfire exploded. Horses screamed against their tethers. Evelyn dropped behind the rocks, her breath coming hard, ears ringing from the shot. Bullets sparked against stone. Dirt kicked into the air around her. She clutched the rifle tighter, reloading with trembling hands. She had fired once, and she would fire again if it meant saving him. James's head snapped up at the sound, recognition flashing through his pain-dulled eyes. He saw Cain curse and clutch his shoulder, saw his men scatter, and then he understood. Evelyn. She was here. She had come for him, against all odds. A surge of strength, raw and primal, ripped through him. He twisted against the chains, the iron biting into his wrists until blood ran fresh. His muscles strained, teeth gritted, every ounce of his being focused on breaking free. The wood of the post creaked under his weight. Another twist, another pull, and one shackle snapped. Pain seared through his arms, but freedom gave him fire. He lunged against the remaining chain, wrenching it until the nail holding it to the post ripped free. James fell hard onto the dirt, but he was no longer a prisoner. He was a man unleashed. The gang turned on him, but James moved like a wounded animal refusing to die. He ripped a pistol from the belt of the nearest outlaw, firing point blank. The man dropped. Another came at him with a knife. James swung the broken length of chain, cracking it across the man's skull. Chaos churned around him, firelight turning every movement into shadow and flame. Evelyn emerged from cover, her eyes blazing. She fired again, the shot catching an outlaw in the leg, sending him sprawling. Her heart thundered, terror and courage tangled together. But she kept moving. She wasn't just fighting for James, she was fighting for herself, for every lonely night she'd endured, for every whisper that called her cursed. Tonight, she would write a different story. The battle raged loud enough to reach Dry Creek. Townsfolk stirred from their beds, peering through windows, listening to the thunder of rifles rolling across the desert. The sheriff stood on his porch, jaw tight, knowing what it meant. This was no longer a distant threat, it was here, at their very doorstep. Some men reached for their guns, others barred their doors, praying the storm would pass them by. Whispers spread Evelyn's out, there, with him. The town stood at a crossroads, to fight beside her, or abandon her to the fate they had long warned her about. Back in the canyon, the fire burned brighter as the fight reached its peak. James, half delirious with blood loss, fought with a fury that surprised even himself. Each move was fueled by Evelyn's presence, her voice calling his name, her rifle cutting down his enemies. She had risked everything for him. He would not fall now. But Cain was not beaten. Despite his wound, he bellowed orders, rallying his men with the force of rage alone. He saw James tearing through the camp like a ghost, refusing burial. He saw Evelyn, fierce and unrelenting, her eyes locked on saving him. And for the first time, Cain's sneer twisted into something darker, desperation. James stumbled near the fire, his vision blurring. An outlaw lunged at him from behind, blade raised. Evelyn screamed his name, raising her rifle, firing. The man crumpled inches from James's back. James turned, saw her framed in the firelight, and in that instant, everything else fell away. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was love, raw and undeniable, binding them in the heart of battle. Then the dust began to settle. Bodies lay strewn across the dirt, groaning men clutching wounds, flames licking higher as spilled whiskey fed the fire. Evelyn lowered her rifle, chest heaving, sweat and tears streaking her face. James stumbled toward her, bloodied but alive, the chain still dangling from his wrist like a broken shackle. For a moment, it seemed over. For a moment, hope dared to bloom. And then Cain moved, like a shadow rising from hell itself. He surged forward, his uninjured arm snapping around Evelyn's throat, yanking her back against him. His pistol pressed hard against her temple, his grip unyielding. Evelyn gasped, the rifle slipping from her hands, her body pinned against the outlaw's iron hold. James froze, his heart dropping into his boots. Cain's eyes gleamed, And with savage triumph, his blood-soaked grin inches from Evelyn's cheek. "Thought you could take me, Whitlock," Kane spat, his voice venomous. "Thought you could steal victory with your cursed little widow." He pressed the gun harder against her skin, making her wince. "No. If I go down tonight, she goes with me." The camp went silent, every surviving outlaw watching, waiting. The fire crackled, the noose swayed in the breeze, and the desert held its breath. With Evelyn trapped in Kane's grip, a pistol to her head, James faced an impossible choice: surrender, or risk watching the woman he loved die before his eyes. With a knife to her throat, Evelyn's final plea broke James's heart. The night had gone silent, all sound swallowed by the blade pressed against Evelyn's skin. The campfire spat sparks, casting Kane's twisted grin in jagged light. James stood a few yards away, his pistol heavy in his hand, his body trembling from blood loss and rage. Every instinct screamed at him to fire, but Kane's knife glinted too close to Evelyn's throat. One wrong move, and she would be gone. "Drop it," Kane snarled, his voice harsh with triumph, "or I'll bleed her out right here in front of you." Evelyn gasped against his grip, her eyes locking onto James's. "Don't," she whispered, her voice shaking but fierce. "Don't give him what he wants." The words tore through him. She was willing to risk herself to keep him from surrendering. It shattered the last wall inside James's chest. His hands tightened on his gun, but his heart clenched with terror. If he shot too fast, she would die. If he waited too long, Kane would slit her throat. Kane laughed low, the sound sharp as broken glass. "Look at you, Whitlock, the great betrayer, the coward of Clearwater, brought to your knees by a woman. Poetic, ain't it?" James's teeth ground together, his voice raw. "Let her go, Kane. This is between you and me." Kane pressed the knife, harder, a bead of blood blooming at Evelyn's skin. She winced but held her head high, her breath coming fast. "No, James," she whispered again, her eyes fierce. "Don't give him the satisfaction." Something inside her broke free then, not fear, but defiance. Evelyn had been called cursed her entire life, a woman meant only for loss. But she refused to let her story end in silence. She drove her elbow backward with sudden force, slamming it into Kane's ribs. The outlaw grunted, momentarily loosened his grip, and Evelyn twisted hard, ducking low to the ground. James didn't hesitate. He fired. The shot cracked through the night, striking Kane's shoulder and spinning him backward. He roared in fury, dropping the knife but keeping his pistol trained on James. The camp exploded in chaos once more, men scrambling to their feet, shouting orders. Evelyn rolled across the dirt, grabbing for Kane's fallen blade. James charged forward, another bullet tearing past him as Kane fired wildly. The two men collided, fists and fury replacing gunfire. James slammed into Kane, their bodies crashing against the post where James had been chained hours earlier. Dust rose around them as they grappled, each blow fueled by years of hatred. Kane sneered through bloodied teeth. "You'll never outrun me, Whitlock. You'll never outrun what you did." James's fist cracked against his jaw, sending him reeling. "I'm done running," James growled. But Kane was a monster built by cruelty. He surged forward again, tackling James into the dirt. They rolled, hands clawing for control of the pistol between them. The gun went off, the shot ringing into the sky, neither man sure who had fired it. Evelyn rushed forward, the knife in her grip. Her hands shook, but her eyes blazed. Kane pinned James beneath him, the pistol inching toward James's chest. James strained, muscles quaking, but Kane's strength pressed down like iron. Then Evelyn struck. She drove the blade into Kane's side with every ounce of strength she had. His roar split the air, his body jerking back in shock. James seized the moment, wrenching the pistol free and firing once more. The shot tore through Kane's chest. The outlaw staggered, blood soaking his shirt, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked between them, James half dead, Evelyn fierce and unyielding, and for the first time, his sneer broke. Then he collapsed into the dirt, lifeless. The camp went still. The surviving outlaws, seeing their leader fallen, scrambled into the darkness, their loyalty shattered. Only the crackle of fire and the labored breaths of James and Evelyn filled the night. Evelyn dropped the knife, her knees buckling as the adrenaline drained away. James caught her before she fell, his arm pulling her close despite his wounds. She pressed her forehead against his chest, tears streaking her face. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered. "You almost did," he admitted, his voice thick with exhaustion and emotion. He cupped her face, forcing her to meet his gaze. "But you saved me." Again. For a moment, neither spoke. The fire's glow softened, the desert wind cooled, and the chaos of the night seemed to fade into silence. James's hand lingered on her cheek, his thumb brushing away the tears. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. Evelyn shook her head. "You deserve someone who sees you for who you are now, not who you were." His gray eyes softened, the hardness that had always guarded them finally cracking. He leaned closer, his voice low, trembling but certain. "Evelyn, you're my home." The words hung in the air, fragile and powerful, more binding than any chain. Evelyn's tears turned to quiet laughter, her forehead resting against his. She had begged him once not to leave her, and now, at last, he had given her the only promise that mattered. They sat together in the dirt, surrounded by ashes and ghosts, holding on as though the world could not pry them apart again. By dawn, the sheriff and a handful of townsfolk arrived, drawn by the echoes of the night's violence. They found the camp empty but for the fallen. They found Evelyn and James together, battered but alive, and in that moment, the whispers that had haunted Evelyn seemed to quiet. For once, the town saw not a cursed woman and a dangerous drifter, but two souls who had fought the darkness and lived. The sun rose, gilding the canyon in light. James, still weak but standing, leaned against Evelyn as they walked back toward Dry Creek. Behind them lay blood and memory, ahead of them uncertainty. But between them there was hope. The past had not disappeared. It never would. But together, they carried it differently. Together, they had chosen not to run. And as they crossed into the light of morning, James whispered once more, softer than the wind but strong enough to last a lifetime. "You're my home." What would you have done if you were in Evelyn's place? Would you forgive James? Or walk away forever? Tell me in the comments below. I'll be reading each one. If this story kept you hooked till the end, hit that like button. It tells me you want more tales from the Wild West. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications because the next story is even darker, deadlier, and harder to walk away from.